Hello, everybody. All right, the semester is quickly winding down. I think there's 2 weeks left after this, so that means your final paper is going to be due soon. So please don't hesitate to ask me any questions. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me or call me or stop by office hours, whichever. Don't hesitate. I'd rather answer questions now than see you get a poor grade on your final paper because you didn't ask me something. All right, so this week we're going to talk about DeRadicalization. Now, you hear a lot of talk about radicalization and how people get radicalized and how it leads to committing terrorist acts. So this week we're going to spend some time discussing how to de-radicalize someone. Once someone is radicalized, how can we really, it's not a real word, but unradicalize them, right? So the interesting thing about radicalization is that lots of people are radicalized. Doesn't matter which ideology. There are lots of people in the world that have really radical ideas, but only a relatively small number of people who are actually radicalized actually take it to the next level and commit violent acts. So, what separates those people? What is it that makes those people do violent acts and others not? That's the $1,000,000 question. Is this something personal to that particular person? Was it something that occurred during the radicalization process that pushed one person but not the other? So some of those questions there aren't hard and fast answers to. It's things that are still being studied. People are still trying to figure it out. But anyway, let's go ahead and get going on the material for this week. There's a lot of information in these articles, and there's no way that I'm going to be able to really cover what's in them in the time that we have in a video. It'd have to be a whole series of videos. There's books written about de-radicalization, so I'll kind of do the best I can here with just some quick kind of summaries, of the readings. So all the readings for this week are in the readings folder. There's no reading material in the book, and there won't be until the last week of class. So we have articles from Randy Borum, John Horgan, Ari Kuglansky, and then actually one of my articles is in there too. But Borum, Horgan, and Kuglansky are all very, very well-known researchers in the area of de-radicalization. So let's start with Horgan. He's dedicated much of his career to the study of radicalization and de-radicalization. So one of the themes that you'll notice throughout all the articles is that while we often think of radicalization, de-radicalization as this individual process, it's actually an individual and a group process. Okay, so groups can radicalize, people within the groups can radicalize as part of a group, or people individually can radicalize, and you've heard stories about, all of those. So Horgan begins by presenting several different perspectives on the determinants of a group movement decline. And as you read through those examples, it's important to note that these processes are complex, right? You can't just look at one, particular context or another and say, well, that's what happens and that's what happens. There's a variety of aspects and conditions. So that's one of the things that kind of hinders this research is determining, how things kind of can be applied across contexts. All right, so Horgan, out of all this stuff, he developed two pretty broad categories for individual disengagement: psychological disengagement and physical disengagement. So some of the factors related to psychological engagement are things like disillusionment with what actually happens when people join a terrorist group versus what they thought would happen. So kind of this fantasy versus reality. Now, if you've been following the news at all, this particular one is really relevant right now to the case of Hoda Muthana, who left America to join ISIS. Now, it's impossible to say for sure, what happened or why she wants to come back or whatever. Just all we know is what she's been saying through her lawyer and through her family. But essentially, she had this romanticized version of ISIS, and she was radicalized online, and then snuck out of America and went and joined ISIS. And then when she got there, it obviously was very, very different than what she thought it was going to be. People can also become disillusioned by disagreements over the use of tactics. Want to use violence, don't want to use violence, want to do a particular thing, don't want to do a particular thing. You can get disillusioned over that. Disillusionment over strategic, political, or ideological differences. Sometimes people simply get burned out, and people's personal priorities change, right? When you start, someone might start in a terrorist group, and then a year later, their situation changes, or they want to get married, or they, who knows what. But personal factors can also change. So these are obviously very broad kind of categories. You can see how there can be any number of specific type of events or incidents that could fall within those categories. What we're going to also discuss is physical disengagement. Physical disengagement is obviously going to be easier to identify than psychological disengagement. So you're talking about things like, people can leave either voluntarily or involuntarily, or can simply just change roles within the group. So you're talking about things like arrest, imprisonment, death, right? Those are three pretty obvious types of physical disengagement. People also may be kicked out of groups, or they could just leave on their own. And then Horgan does a really nice job kind of illustrating each of those types of concepts. All right, the next article is by Borum, and he focuses almost exclusively on radicalization. Now, it's important to understand radicalization because it may lead to an understanding of de-radicalization, right? If there's another author, Utz, who said that the factors that lead to the formation of a terrorist group may also lead to that group declining or failing. So, the same concept could apply here for radicalization. So Borum identifies a variety of group and individual level processes that people in groups may experience that lead to radicalization. So even though he talks about group, he talks about individual, and it could occur at both those levels, it could also occur at multiple levels. Not just group, not just individual. It could be occurring at multiple levels at the same time. So within these different levels and these processes, you have things that are pulling people in that direction, or you have things that are pushing people in those directions. But the process, even though we're trying to talk broadly about this process here, the process is different for everybody. Each person that's being radicalized may be affected differently by the things that are happening. So, regardless of how it impacts people individually or whatever, the generally accepted notion is that radicalization is a process and may depend on discrete steps that occur in a particular order. Like a process model, like this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and this happens, or particular decisions or particular things could happen that get someone ready to progress to the next level. Okay, so it doesn't have to necessarily be step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, like in a process model. It could be, this variety of things have all happened, and they work together to move somebody to the next level. All right, so the next article is by Kruglansky and his co-authors. There's a lot of information in this article. This article in itself could probably be a series of 15-minute videos. So Kruglansky frames radicalization as the quest for significance. So essentially, radicalization is a quest for someone to matter. Okay, so the process through which they are radicalized is in pursuit of this quest to matter. Right? So their process will be whatever, because I'm trying to get to this particular point where I'm going to matter. So kind of how this happens is, first, the person loses their significance. It could happen through some kind of individual humiliation, group humiliation. It could be movement related. It could not be movement related. It could be just about anything, right? But all of a sudden somebody feels like they don't matter. Over the course of time, they begin to feel like they don't matter. So they then view the terrorist group, the terrorist activity, as a way for them to regain their significance and to be a part of something important. So he goes through all the entire process of this, talking about ideology, and it's way, way, way too much. I can't really even get started in it, because if I got started in it, then I would have to discuss all of it. I couldn't just kind of piecemeal it. But he talks about that whole process, and then he also discusses DeRadicalization as well. Please spend time reading this article. It's really good. Really spend some time thinking about and digesting it. All right, then the final article is by me, Cermak, Freilich, and Fitzgerald, and it's an article that I wrote, or a book chapter that I wrote while I was still getting my PhD, but it looks at radicalization from a risk perspective. And this article focuses on group radicalization, specifically domestic far-right extremist groups. So as groups radicalize, dynamics within that group play a role. And one particular aspect that's important is groupthink. And I believe it was Borum's article. He discussed aspects of groupthink as well. But groupthink contributes to group cohesiveness and the adoption of attitudes portrayed by the leader in the group. Essentially, it's a way that everyone in the group starts thinking the same way about whatever particular subject it is. So they also, or in this article, we also looked at how certain group characteristics separate violent and nonviolent groups. And found that violent far-right groups were more likely to recruit in places that were considered hotbeds of radicalization. Prisons, protests, hate rock concerts. Okay, and then also research suggested that groups with links to other groups are more likely to radicalize to violence. And we found that violent groups were more likely to have relationships with both international and domestic far-right groups. And then finally, leadership is important when it comes to radicalization. And we found that violent far-right groups had different leadership structures than did non-violent groups, and those particular structures were more prone to violent activity. So, because of the differences found between violent and non-violent groups, it's important to look at these different group characteristics when you're assessing possible threats for groups committing violence. So that's really a real quick kind of summary of the readings for this week. There's a ton of good information in the articles, so please take the time to read these articles thoroughly and think about how they all relate to each other. And be sure to complete the discussion board. And if you have questions about your papers, please don't hesitate to ask. And I'll see you next week.